Today is Saturday, May 3rd, 2025, and this is William Michael, Headmaster of Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This week, my wife and I drove halfway across the country to attend military graduation for our 6th child, our 5th soldier, and bring him home. So I had about 30 hours in the car to spend listening to an audio book that I have intended to read, thinking about the content of it and how it affects modern education and discussion. The title of the book is How the Atomic Bomb Was Made, by an author named Richard Rhodes, and I believe it was a Pulitzer Prize winning book. I was interested in studying this book because I hoped that through a detailed history of the events that led to the making of the atomic bomb, I would gain some knowledge of the details of those developments, how the science actually developed that led to the so-called atomic bomb. And the reason why I'm interested in this as a classicist is because this is ultimately argued to be the proof for modern atomic theory. And if you don't know, atomic theory is an ancient philosophical idea. It was proposed by the Epicureans way back in ancient Greek history. And it was always associated with atheism. So there were Greeks who explained the origins of things by appealing to mythology, which we really should call theology, as far as the Greeks are concerned. They were called the theologians, who gave divine explanations, mythological explanations for the causes of things. And then there were philosophers like Aristotle and Plato, who sought to give more reasoned explanations for the causes of things. And then, of course, in Christian history and in Jewish history, there were men and women informed by divine revelation who were told by God what the causes of things were, what their final causes especially are. And so there were a number of different camps one could belong to if one sought to know the causes of things. The sort of atheistic and materialistic camp, which was predominantly atomistic, because they just explained that there was a natural explanation for everything that could be found in the atoms of all natural things. And one could be a secular philosopher, or one could be a theologian, or some combination. Thomas Aquinas, St. Albert the Great, in the 13th century, I should say 12th and 13th centuries, showed that Aristotelian philosophy and Catholic theology could be viewed as two sides of the same coin, really presenting the same message. Aristotle's philosophy from the perspective of human reason, and Catholic theology from the perspective of divine revelation. So scholasticism was a position where Aristotelian philosophy and Catholic theology were united into a single system. And I would argue that this is the truth about or the true source, I should say, to know the causes of all things in this world. And so from the time of Thomas Aquinas, when he published not only the Summa Theologica, which many people talk about, but also the Summa Contra Gentiles, which I would argue is even more important. From the mid to late 1200s until the 1500s, when the Protestant Reformation or Protestant Schism developed, that scholastic worldview gained a stranglehold on human learning because it was so effective, so irrefutable, that it just dismantled all opposition. And we see this illustrated in paintings which you can find online if you search for the triumph of Thomas Aquinas. You'll see these images of Thomas Aquinas enthroned above all of the different heretics, all the different representatives of the arts and sciences, the triumph of Thomas Aquinas. And that was the state of things moving into the 1500s. And then all hell broke loose. And there were a number of revolutions against scholasticism that came from a number of different sources. One being the so-called Renaissance, which called for an abandonment of scholasticism and a return to abandoned secular ancient philosophy and culture. The second was Protestant Schism, which introduced a new interpretation of Christianity founded upon heretical ideas, which were condemned by the church. And then thirdly, the scientific revolution led by Francis Bacon, who really proposed the philosophy and mission of that scientific revolution in his work, The Novum Organum. Now, what's significant is that the rejection of scholasticism was called for by Francis Bacon because he argued that it was not, well, let me just back up a little bit. Francis Bacon argued that the natural world, that is the material world, should not be investigated by either philosophy or theology. But because it's material, it should be investigated by the senses, by human observation. And so nothing in the material realm should be considered to be true or proven. Causes of material phenomena should never be sought by means of philosophical or theological reasoning. The causes of material things should be sought in material things themselves, and this should be done by means of a systematic human observation, empiricism. The actual study, the conducting of experiments or tests that provide observed evidence, and nothing should be called true unless it is observable. The saying, seeing is believing, that's the idea. So if you can't demonstrate something to be true to the senses in the material realm, Bacon argued that you haven't proven it to be true. It's merely an opinion. And so Francis Bacon is considered the father of the scientific method. You'll see him presented in modern science textbooks as such, as the father of the scientific method. Now, the heart of Francis Bacon's argument, I think, is quite respectable. He says, look, if you're going to say that something is true in the material world that we live in, you should be able to prove that it's so. We should be able to measure it, to see it, to taste it, to hear it, to feel it. If it's material, if the assertion that you're making concerns material things, then you should be able to show it to be true. I think we can all agree that that's a respectable argument. If I'm going to say that nitrogen increases plant growth in the garden, I should be able to show that to be true by isolating nitrogen as the only variable and being able to not only show the effects, but continually show the effects, to reproduce the effects. I should be able to pose a cause or an answer to a question based on an intelligent guess, as it were, a hypothesis. And then I should be able to conduct an experiment or a test that isolates a variable so that the hypothesis can be tested. And then I should be able to reproduce those effects to prove that there's not some other influence at work, but we really have isolated and identified the cause. I don't think anyone can argue against that. I should be able to show that when the only difference in the soil is the addition of nitrogen, and the result, again and again, is increased production, it would seem that the cause of that increased production was the nitrogen, all other things being the same. That's what the scientific method is supposed to be. So I don't think we could criticize Francis Bacon for proposing such an idea, rather than having, for example, a priest tell us that we should garden a certain way because it's God's will, or to have a philosopher argue that we should garden a certain way because based on some assertion he claims to be self-evident, by means of deduction, this would be the recommended method. It makes sense that we should be able to demonstrate to the senses that an assertion we make is in fact true. And so out of this develops what we call the scientific method. Now, I would argue that this wasn't really Francis Bacon's intention to create some disinterested, neutral approach to truth-seeking. I would argue that Francis Bacon, being strongly anti-scholastic, was looking for a way to justify abandoning scholastic philosophy and restricting demonstration to the senses was, for him, an effective way of doing that. The real motive of promoting this idea of empiricism was to break free from that stranglehold of scholasticism, to
try and overturn the triumph of Thomas Aquinas. And the method that he lays out provided a sufficient argument for most men in society at that time who were themselves eager to throw off the yoke of Catholic authority and Aristotelian philosophy, that is, scholasticism. And we see this done in the name of a scientific revolution, which was really no such thing, as we'll see over time. Now, I would argue that Bacon's idea of restricting proofs in the natural sciences to observable, reproducible tests or experiments made sense to people who thought that the natural world was much simpler than it actually is. The idea of experimental science is attractive to simpletons, people who really don't understand how complex, how mysterious the world is. For such people, this idea of demonstrating causes to the senses by reproducible tests seems like it would be a good idea. However, what happened over time was as men began these experiments, they began to realize that the natural world was really infinitely complex. The more they dug, the further they looked, the more powerful the microscopes became. They found that the complexity just continues to multiply and multiply and multiply. And as they continued to try and promote this Baconian approach to truth-seeking in the natural world, in the early 1900s, it finally became crystal clear that the scientific method cannot work. It cannot be a source of certain knowledge about the causes in the natural world. And this was argued by the famous physicist and chemist Niels Bohr, again in the early 1900s. Now, what I was seeking as I studied this book on the history of the development of the atomic bomb, I wanted to know what the tests were, what the actual demonstrations were, what the experiments were that allowed these scientists to make the claims that they made, because they would need to be observable and reproducible or shareable. And I know, as a matter of fact, that no one has ever observed an atom, a proton, a neutron, an electron, or anything else at the so-called atomic level. I know that no one has ever observed an atom. And my argument is always, if the atom cannot be observed, if the properties of the atom, when claims are made that an atom is a material body that is actually composed of this and that and this, if that can't be demonstrated to the senses by means of reproducible reproducible tests, then it simply cannot be asserted as a scientific fact. In fact, it doesn't fulfill the requirements of the scientific method. It remains a theory. And my argument has always been that the atomic theory, which was proposed in modern times, is nothing but a theory. It is not a fact. It is not demonstrated. It cannot be demonstrated, nor will it be demonstrated, because it's false. Atomism, again, can be disproven or proven impossible by philosophical arguments, which Aristotle did in the 4th century BC. That's why atomism was abandoned by the ancient philosophers. So I wanted to read this book hoping, because I heard that it was an exhaustive study of the history of the development of the atomic bomb. I wanted to study this book to see if I could find details about how any of the steps were demonstrated by means of reproducible experiments. And as I've gone through the book, I found exactly what I expected, that no such demonstrations were ever made. There was a theory, there was an atomic theory that scientists were committed to, which is fine, again. In the scientific method, it's fine to say, I believe this to be true. But what the method requires, the scientific method, is that one put that theory to the test, put that hypothesis to the test, and let the results of the tests judge the theory. Now, if there is a test conducted, and if there are effects produced that appear to agree with the theory, that is not a proof that the theory is true. All that is evidence that the theory appears to be possible. In fact, it's quite impossible for experimentation or inductive reasoning to ever prove something affirmatively, to prove something positively. Really, induction, which is the method of investigation used in the scientific method, it's effective in proving that something is impossible. But it's not very effective in proving an assertion to be positively true. It's not effective in affirmation, but it can be effective in negation. And so when we hear claims that this experiment proved that this is true positively, we should always doubt that that's the case, because induction rarely proves anything positively. That's why the ancient philosophers didn't use it, because they knew that, not because they were stupid and modern scientists are so smart. It's because they already knew that the scientific method would not work, would not establish positive truths, positive sciences, which was Aristotle's goal. So the scientific method was really an example of sophistry, pretending to be interested in the truth, when in fact it was just looking for a justification for rejecting the established scholastic philosophy. Now what happened, and I'm still in the process of reading, but what happened with atomic theory is that a few of these great scientists, and I do respect them as great scientists, I think that they were innocent in pursuing what they thought to be the truth by means that they thought would be effective. But what happened was, when they had evidence that, first of all, the method would not be effective, rather than admitting that the scientific method was in fact found to fail and prove itself to be incapable of discovering the truth of the natural world, they quietly pivoted and presented theories on top of theories that allowed their so-called research to just keep moving forward. And this has to do with what's called quantum theory or quantum mechanics. If we think about all of the talk about Sir Isaac Newton and his laws of nature, Newton's laws, we'll find that those laws, which are referred to as classical mechanics, not to be confused with classical in the ancient sense. It's called classical relative to modern explanations which have rejected Newton's laws. Newton's laws of nature assumed that the natural world was quite simple. To put it simply, Newton thought natural bodies were big, and therefore observable experiments could explain the causes of natural phenomena. Newton wasn't a microbiologist. By the time that we enter into the 20th century, and scientists are really digging into this atomic theory, it became evident that Newton's laws, the principles of classical mechanics, appeared to be effective when it was assumed that the natural world was quite simple. But as the complexity of the natural world was discovered, and that complexity multiplied, it became evident that what was accepted as the laws of nature were found to not effectively explain what was observed. And so when we talk about, or when we hear about quantum theory, quantum mechanics, we're referring to the study of mechanics, just like Isaac Newton was seeking to study mechanics, the laws of nature. But for a natural world that is found to be much more complex than Newton or Bacon had ever anticipated, where the bodies and the forces being studied are so small that Newton's laws and Bacon's aspirations really don't work. What Niels Bohr came to realize in his attempts to study nature at the atomic level was that the human interaction with bodies that would be the size of, and again, this is all theoretical, the bodies the size of atoms, or even protons and neutrons, and forces at that level of smallness, anything that was attempted to be measured would be influenced by the human interaction when the effort was made to measure it. And so the conclusion that Niels Bohr came to was that the causes of the natural world, the phenomena in the natural world, if they are to be pursued at this so-called atomic level, the causes cannot be known scientifically. Niels Bohr, again, one of the most famous 20th century scientists, made it public through his experiments that the knowledge, the scientific knowledge, according to the so-called scientific method, where everything has to be demonstrated to the senses, the knowledge of the natural world, because of its complexity, could not be obtained by means of these simple mechanical experiments, measurements, and so on. I will argue that Niels Bohr's conclusion was a confession that Francis Bacon's scientific method had been found to fail. The scientific method was proven to fail because of the complexity of the natural world, which to this day remains unknown. As I said, the complexity multiplies every time the scientists develop instruments that can go further, that can see farther, that can view smaller bodies, and so on. The more powerful the instruments become, the more complex we find the world to be. And we've come to the point, says Niels Bohr, where our interaction with these bodies, if they are, in fact, true, would cause them to change, and therefore they cannot be observed or measured as they would actually exist without our interference. And so there can be no accurate measurement or observation of these natural phenomena. And so what Niels Bohr proposed was a concept that he called complementarity. And this idea of complementarity basically argued that we can't expect to have any actual measurement of these natural phenomena according to the expectations, really the demand of the scientific method. And so at that point, Niels Bohr, I would argue, declared that the study of the atom and the attempt to prove the structure of the atom and the properties of the atom was no longer a scientific investigation, but was now a matter of philosophy. It was no longer an investigation pursued by means of the scientific method to demonstrate to the senses the truth of the material world. It was now to be returned to a philosophical investigation. And men like Niels Bohr, because of this idea of complementarity, in light of the complexity of the natural world, could call themselves scientists and present their conclusions as scientific, even though they were actually merely philosophizing. They were proposing a hypothesis, and rather than testing that hypothesis, they were simply providing evidence that their hypothesis was possible, that it continued to appear to agree with what could be observed. They were not demonstrating their theory to be true. They were simply showing that it was possible. And this is not science. This is actually a low quality kind of philosophy. This is really going back to the Socratic method, where Socrates would show that certain opinions were impossible by simply allowing them to run their course and showing that they led to contradictions which couldn't be escaped from. And so the law of non-contradiction became the hammer that Socrates used to prove that certain views were impossible. However, the fact that an idea could make it through Socrates' questioning without leading to a contradiction didn't prove that it was actually true. It simply survived the examination. Perhaps Socrates hadn't thought of an effective line of questioning that would lead to a self-contradiction. So, an opinion that could survive Socratic examination continued to be acceptable as a possible solution. And this is what modern science, so-called science, has become. It's become an exercise where ideas, opinions, theories, hypotheses are examined not to prove that they're actually true, as Francis Bacon desired, but to simply show that they can continue to be held without having been proven impossible yet. They're not proven true. They're simply shown to continue to appear possible. And so the standard for the scientific investigation was changed for the sake of this atomic theory. And this is articulated, as I said, in Bohr's principle of complementarity, which was his way of explaining away the failure of the scientific method. Now, Niels Bohr was motivated to continue this momentum with his atomic theory. His whole career was based on the possibility that he had discovered the true nature of the most fundamental building block of all material bodies that would explain all natural phenomena by natural means. The experimentation, as I said, proved not just the theory to be impossible to demonstrate, but it proved the scientific method to be an ineffective means of establishing truth about the natural world. And science changed. Real science, the real work done by so-called scientists, changed from this arrogant pursuit of truth, absolute truth, as desired by Francis Bacon, to really just seeking support for one's philosophical commitments. When we look at the atomic bomb, and again, I'm continuing to go through this book very carefully. When we look at the atomic bomb, and we say, where does all of this power come from? When this atomic bomb detonates, and there's this incredible release of energy, where does that energy come from? What is the cause of that energy? The cause is not proven to be Bohr's atomic theory or explanation. Bohr's explanation continues to appear to be a possible explanation of the cause. The evidence that exists, which is limited, really doesn't bring us to the level that we would need to reach for positive demonstration. Does not contradict or prove Bohr's theory to be impossible. And that's all that can be said. Bohr's theory has not been proven impossible. That's all that can be said. Now what's unfortunate is that almost no one is interested in proposing an alternative explanation. And this has a lot to do with how science is taught in modern schools. And we can't just blame this on public schools or on liberal universities, because Christians and private schools, even home schools, are guilty of the same fault. I was a pre-med student at Rutgers University, a leading research university, Big Ten university. I studied biology, chemistry, and so on, physics, at the university as a pre-med student, and I was a Dean's List biology major. We were never introduced to any of this philosophy. We were never introduced to any of this history. The real nature of scientific investigations, the real status of scientific theories and demonstrations was never presented to us. We were simply handed textbooks that summarized information that were filled with assertions about the natural world, and we were told to study the content of these books, and we were tested on our knowledge of the content of these books. That's what it meant to receive a science education at a research university. And so I don't want anyone to try and pretend that oh, well, you just say these things because you don't know science, or you just say these things because you never studied. I did study science. I received A's in university science classes. I worked in a science laboratory. I was a science student at a major research university. So I don't want to hear this appeal or this accusation of ignorance, because it's not true. Students in modern schools, and I would argue in all schools, are taught that these scientific ideas, these explanations, have been positively demonstrated to be true, and that's false. And this is one of the reasons why this modern atomic theory, many of these different modern theories like evolutionary theory and biology, these have become replacements for scholastic philosophy. They have a stranglehold on the study of the natural sciences. But unlike scholastic philosophy, they're dishonest. Their stranglehold, their control of modern natural sciences is unjust. It's undeserved. It's unearned. And this is what's different between the current situation in modern education and the situation that existed in the 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. Scholastic philosophy stepped up to the podium and said, "This is philosophy. We begin reasoning from assertions that we believe to be self-evident. And by accurate reasoning, we move from those truths to these conclusions which are equally true by means of the art of reasoning." Scholasticism is honest about being a philosophical system that employs a certain philosophical method, namely Aristotle's demonstrative reasoning. Modern science is dishonest. Modern science presents itself as something that it's actually not. Modern science presents itself as something different from scholastic philosophy. It says, oh no, we're not philosophers. We don't accept philosophical arguments or religious arguments in questions of material phenomena, in natural studies. We observe the scientific method. We seek to demonstrate the causes of things in observable and reproducible ways by means of experimentation. We accept nothing that can't be demonstrated and proven to be true, proven to the senses to be true. That's a lie. Students, millions and millions and millions of students are taught that science is not like philosophy. It doesn't accept good arguments. It doesn't accept clever reasoning. It demands reproducible, observable, material evidence. And all of its assertions have been so demonstrated, and that is a lie. The stranglehold that these modern theories have on modern science education, on the study of the natural world in general, is an unjust stranglehold. It's an undeserved authority and control. It's false. And what's happening, instead of promoting the knowledge of the natural world. It's actually preventing students from seeking knowledge of the natural world. It's deceiving Christian students by telling them that all of its assertions have been demonstrated by means of scientific experiments. The kids are taught the scientific method, and then they're led to believe that this is how all of the assertions in their textbook have been established, and that's false. What they're actually being taught is an alternative to scholastic philosophy. They're being taught an atheistic philosophy of the natural world, which is not rooted in reproducible, observable, shareable demonstrations. They're being presented with a worldview, an explanation of causes that is philosophical, which is an alternative to the philosophical worldview that was being taught to students in the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries in the name of scholasticism. Scholasticism, as a philosophical worldview that earned its place by philosophical demonstrations which are appropriate for philosophical questions. Scholastic philosophy earned its place by demonstrations. Demonstrations that we can still read anytime. We can go and read St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Contra Gentiles. We can go and read St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. We can go and read Thomas Aquinas' commentaries on the philosophical writings of Aristotle. We can read the commentaries of St. Albert the Great on the philosophical works of Aristotle. All of the arguments, all of the philosophical demonstrations that were provided to establish scholastic philosophy as the best explanation, not just of material phenomena, but of all phenomena. Scholastic philosophy earned its place. Thomas Aquinas earned his triumph by means of honest philosophical demonstration. That triumph, as I said, was brought into suspicion by false accusations and insincere proposals from Francis Bacon, which over time, over a matter of 300 years, almost exactly 300 years, were proven to be impossible. The scientific method, you see, we can get distracted by wrangling about atomic theory. We can get distracted by wrangling about evolutionary theory. But that's a distraction from the real problem. The real problem is that the scientific method, which is assumed in both of those discussions, the scientific method itself has been proven to be ineffective, incapable of demonstrating the truth of the natural world. We do not have to answer questions from atomic theorists today, because it's already been admitted by their great heroes that their experimentation did not prove their theories. We do not have to answer all of the detailed arguments of biologists arguing for the evolution of species, which assumes the scientific method to be true and effective. The entire discussion should be rejected because the method of that investigation is in fact ineffective. The entire discussion of the nature of the atom is really a giant circular argument. And the demand that we answer these questions with observable, demonstrative evidence assumes that the scientific method will actually lead us to the truth when it has been proven, because of the complexity observed in the natural world, to be incapable of serving as the method of truth-seeking. And so what Christians are doing, arguing with scientists, like these creation scientists arguing about what the geological evidence shows and what it means, arguing and answering all of these demands. The entire discussion is flawed, because what's being assumed at the beginning of it is that the scientific method is the method that should be employed in the pursuit of the truth, to which we're all accountable in our thoughts and opinions about causes in the natural world. And that has been demonstrated to be false. And this is the great sophistical trap that modern Christians are in, where they think they're so clever because they've got a Christian biology book and a Christian chemistry book and a Christian physics book. They think they're so clever because they've learned these creation science arguments against evolution. They think they're so clever, when in fact they're already conceding defeat in acting as if the scientific method must be employed as the method of proving our thoughts about natural phenomena. Christians in the 21st century are trapped inside of this box of the scientific method, which they do not have to answer to. And what Christians should actually do is, right from the beginning, reject the demands of the so-called scientific method. Or, if they actually do want to be clever, demand direct evidence, demand reproducible, observable demonstrations of any assertion made in the name of natural science. If you do that, you will be met with scorn. If you ask a person who comes to you and makes an assertion about the natural world that comes from one of these modern theories, atomic theory, evolutionary theory, if you ask for them to share with you the observable, reproducible evidence that led them to accept the theory as true, you will find that A, they have no such evidence, and B, they will attempt to pressure you with emotional attacks, scoffing, mocking, and so on, trying to force you, to frighten you into submission, because there is no positive evidence, because the scientific method does not show what they have been deceived, or what they want to say is true in the natural world. They have no evidence of these things. What they can say, if they're honest, they can say, I believe this. I choose this explanation, and as far as I know, it has not been demonstrated to be impossible. That would be accurate. Anything more than that is false. And so as Christians, rather than be duped into this really stupid and mindless wrangling about scientific evidence, we should go back to the study of scholastic philosophy and make sure that what we think as Christians is in harmony with scholastic philosophy, and we should meditate on the principles, on the elements established through the classical liberal arts, established in Aristotelian philosophy, established in scholastic philosophy, given to us by means of divine revelation. We should meditate on those truths and use them to propose solutions to modern questions. We should seek to destroy arguments or theories that contradict scholastic philosophy, not by means of the scientific method, but on philosophical or theological grounds. And we'll often find that there's some truth that must be established first, which, when established, would destroy arguments downstream from it. And that often is neglected by Christians. We must be sensitive to any assertion that's made by a so-called scientific person for which observable, reproducible, that is, shareable evidence cannot be provided. And when they scoff at a request for such evidence, we should accept that as their concession of failure to prove their so-called scientific position. We should not present our positions as scientific, but we should reject the scientific method altogether. We should present our positions as theological, philosophical positions, and present philosophical and theological arguments for them. We will never find that anything observable in nature contradicts what is true in theology or philosophy. And so we should go forward in these discussions if we know theology and philosophy truly, which remains to be proven. We should go forward with confidence so long as we reason from truths that are self-evident or conclusions that have been demonstrated from truths that are self-evident or that are divine. Now this is what I'm promoting in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. It's not a return to some old philosophy. It's not a rejection of scientific facts. It is a rejection of the scientific method. That's true. The scientific method, as I said, can only be employed to demonstrate the impossibility of an assertion made about some material body or some natural phenomenon. It cannot be used to establish any truth absolutely, because it's inductive by nature. We should learn to reason according to the art of reasoning, which we learn by studying Aristotle's Organon. And Christians really need to commit to a renewal of scholastic thinking. If we hold modern scientists or anyone around us speaking in the name of science, if we hold them accountable to the demands of the scientific method, we will find that their arguments are very, very easy to destroy. It doesn't require any Christians to become biologists or chemists or physicists. In fact, that makes no sense. The advantages gained, the practical advantages gained by these sciences, they may be curious or interesting, they may be sources of convenience, but they're never necessary. And we shouldn't allow their value to be exaggerated. There's a reason why people in the Middle Ages didn't seek all of these things sought by modern society, because many of them were religious and knew better. Even if they weren't philosophers themselves, their lives were ordered by true philosophy, by true theology. They were wiser than modern people. They often didn't seek relief from pain because they understood the redemptive nature of human suffering and knew that God could turn evil into good if we offered our sufferings to God voluntarily. People who were prepared to die didn't live in fear of death or seek by any means necessary to avoid it or delay it. They weren't stupid. They were actually wiser than modern people who are panicking in the face of sickness, of pain, of death, like ancient pagans did, and imagining that this is some kind of superior intelligence or progress, when in fact it's a sign of error and foolishness, timidity, all kinds of vices. So again, this is what I'm seeking to promote, really to preserve, to restore in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I hope that's helpful. I think it's pretty clear once you get over this and see through this smoke and mirrors of modern science and modern education. Once you see this, I think it becomes impossible to unsee. But I hope that's helpful, and if you want to move forward positively in the study of Catholic theology, of the classical liberal arts, of scholastic philosophy, I invite you to join us in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. If you'd just like to begin reading some of the sources, you can sign up with an extern account, which is free, and have access to all of the study materials. You can mark things complete that you've read and keep track of your studies. If you want to move beyond that and actually make use of our quizzes and assessments that are graded, you can subscribe with a standard adult enrollment that costs only $10 a month for access to all of our courses. I'm going to be starting live classes in July, which you don't need to attend, but you can watch the recorded videos from those classes. I'll be walking through all of these studies one lesson at a time, and if you'd like to join me again, subscribe for that simple $10 adult enrollment and consider it to be a contribution to the work that we're doing. If you have children and you'd like to have them introduced to these studies, the same opportunities are available to them. The standard student plan costs just $25 a month, and it provides for a complete K-12, even lifelong education. Our program is accredited by Program. It's not some weird Amish school teaching some old, obsolete ideas. We're accredited by COBIA, which is the same accrediting agency that accredits all of the modern public schools and private schools. Nothing weird about what we teach. So if you'd like your children to receive a classical Catholic education, our program's offered to them very affordable, easy to use, all online, self-paced, and so on. So anyway, I invite you to join us. I think if you can get over these false ideas about modern science, these false ideas in modern education, if you can get over this and learn to think rightly about classical Catholic education, you can enjoy a lifetime of very satisfying learning that's very affordable, easily accessible, self-paced, and available anywhere you live, no matter how young or old you may be. If you have any questions, please comment on the video. You can also write to me. My email address is wcm@classicalmemoirs.com. Feel free to send any questions. If you'd like to argue with me, feel free to send any objections. I'm happy to respond. But if you're going to object, make a serious objection. No arrogant scoffing, no ignorant assertions. If you don't have evidence, don't make assertions, because that's what scientific assertions are supposed to be. Assertions with evidence. I hope that's helpful. God bless.